In 1929, the United States was rocked by the crash of the stock market, leaving almost no person unaffected. While great reform was later made by President Franklin Roosevelt, President Herbert Hoover's initial response prevented economic growth and an escape for Americans out of destitution. Hoover's ideology strongly reflected those of the American people at the time of the crash. The economy was meant to be left untouched by the government, which would as a result lead to economic growth and prosperity. However, when this national belief backfired via the crash, Hoover still did not take the unprecedented measures that were needed to pull the country out of the economic hole. Many of Hoover's policies were overly restrictive. He was a firm believer that social welfare was for local governments and private charity, not the federal government's responsibility. The Reconstruction Finance Corporation gave money to corporations and banks to stimulate economic growth and stop the inactivity. The Emergency Relief and Construction Act of 1932 gave money to local governments to help their community. However, in both of these plans, bankruptcy had to be proven, even though it was obvious to most of the country that the funds were needed. These acts also did very little to stimulate growth, as they stemmed from trickle-down ideologies that did little for those in lower social classes. The loans and funding for local governments, banks, and corporations was like putting a temporary band-aid on a gaping wound. It had no long-term impacts that could help to heal the country. Despite a national movement towards more liberal policies, Hoover remained stubborn in his conservative ideologies, and he began to lose favor with the American people. The makeshift towns that began to crop up around cities as people lost their housing were unaffectionately called Hoovervilles due to the president's incompetence. In the end, Hoover's reluctance to stray from his conservative ideologies and his inability to end the Depression resulted in his sweeping defeat against Roosevelt. His policies were archaic and did nothing to solve a problem that had never been faced before. Instead of creating new ideas, he again and again turned to old ones that continued to leave the American people floundering.